listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, it's like a Hollywood spy thriller. A top secret mission by Ukraine to launch targeted drone attacks on Russia that destroyed more than 40 of its aircraft worth a staggering $11 billion. Dubbed Operation Spider's Web, this major attack by Ukraine is being seen as one of Russia's greatest military setbacks since the Second World War. Dr. Malcolm Davis, defence expert with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, joins us for his analysis on why these drone attacks have changed modern warfare forever. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Monday, the 2nd of June. In developing news, Erin Patterson has taken to the stand to give evidence in the mushroom murder trial. The defence team has reportedly called the 50-year-old to give evidence. Ms Patterson is charged with 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. She has pleaded not guilty to all charges. The Prime Minister has defended his government's commitment to defence expenditure after controversial comments by the US Defence Secretary. Peter Hegseth has demanded Australia increase its defence spending to almost $100 billion a year, or an estimated 3.5% of our GDP, as security concerns grow with the Indo-Pacific region. Anthony Albanese has brushed off the demands from the US at a news conference today.
What you should do in defence is decide what you need, your capability, and then provide for it. We've provided an additional $10 billion of investment into defence over the forward estimates. That adds up to 2.3% of GDP.
6 people have been injured in a suspected terror attack in the US. A 45-year-old man is now in custody after setting fire to multiple people at an outdoor mall in Colorado where a rally was being held for Israeli hostages. The FBI addressed the media after the attack.
Witnesses are reporting that the subject used a makeshift flamethrower and threw an incendiary device into the crowd. The suspect was heard to yell, "Free Palestine," during the attack.
And after months of speculation, Joe Montemuro has been announced as the new Matildas coach. The well-respected leader has also worked with Arsenal and Melbourne City and spoke with the media earlier today.
To be given the opportunity to lead probably, I think, one of the best brands in the world, one of the most exciting teams in the world, and to do it at home and to do it with a level of pride, for me, it's something quite emotional.
Now it's time to get into our deep dive with Dr. Malcolm Davis on the Ukraine drone attacks on Russia. As the world nervously waits to see how the Russian president responds to this major military setback, Dr. Davis says this operation has opened our world to a dangerous new frontier in modern warfare of drones and AI. And more than ever, he says Australia needs to urgently increase our defence spending to ensure we're adequately protected. Malcolm, thanks so much for joining us. Let's start with these drone attacks by Ukraine. The details of this coordinated attack by Ukraine are quite extraordinary.
Absolutely. And I think that, this is a wake-up call for military observers around the world in terms of one new aspect of future warfare. I mean, here you had the Ukrainian intelligence services and special forces undertaking a devastating attack using shipping containers on trucks that were basically smuggled into Russia, driven to the target, and then launched these large numbers of drones that were then controlled by Ukrainian personnel. And I think that they carried out this attack very effectively. Each drone was designed to find specific points on those Russian aircraft, the bombers and the airborne early warning aircraft, and they did it very effectively. So I think there's huge implications of this in terms of the war in Ukraine, but there's even broader implications in terms of how we think about future warfare and what defence policies and defence capabilities we need to invest in.
We understand at this stage Ukraine is saying this military operation was overseen by Volodymyr Zelensky. It was 18 months in the planning. And as I mentioned earlier, they hid this weaponry on the back of trucks, and that it was, if this is, correct me if I'm wrong, it was then remotely fired off by people in Ukraine.
That's correct. So, they had probably satellite communications links to the launching systems on the trucks, triggered those launching systems. The drones were then designed to fly out of the containers and were basically controlled from Ukraine and headed towards their targets. And then the drones individually picked out their targets and attacked those targets. And you can see in the footage the drones actually working out which part of the plane to hit to cause the most damage. And, and quite often it was hitting the fuel tanks and the wings. And this was, clearly a case of either human-controlled first-person view drones or drones that were basically intelligent enough to work out themselves how they attacked a target.
Malcolm, it's estimated at this stage that it's wiped out up to 40% of the capability for Russian bombers. How much of a devastating hit is this literally for Russia?
Oh, it's a big hit. I think it's a fantastic victory for Ukraine because what it does is it dramatically blunts Russia's ability to launch long-range glide bombs into targets in Ukraine from those bombers. So they've taken out Tu-95 Bears and potentially some Tu-22M1 backfires as well. That's going to seriously undermine Russia's ability to launch those glide bombs against Ukraine. More significantly, those bombers are part of Russia's nuclear triad. They're designed to carry nuclear weapons in a major war. And so that's significantly eroded Russia's ability to essentially deliver nuclear weapons from the air. Obviously, their missile forces are still intact, but their air-delivered leg of their triad, their bomber-delivered leg, I think has been severely eroded. And a lot of those aircraft can't be replaced because they're no longer in production. So, that means that it's a permanent weakness now for the Russians.
Some military commentators have said this is the biggest loss to Russian military since the end of World War II. Would you agree with that analysis?
It's certainly one of the most significant. I wouldn't say it's the biggest in the sense that if you look at the casualty figures on the front lines in Ukraine, the Russians have been taking massive losses, thousands of troops each day killed. So I certainly think it's one of the most strategically significant losses in terms of the impact this is going to have on Russian confidence. And of course, we can't ignore the fact that Putin is probably going to retaliate in some way, and that retaliation will be big. But nevertheless, damage is done. The Russians have taken a big hit here, and their ability to launch these devastating attacks against Ukrainian cities is being significantly reduced as a result of the success of this mission.
Malcolm, you mentioned there, and we are all nervously watching on to see how Mr. Putin will retaliate. What do you think he will do? Because this he will take incredibly personally, considering Volodymyr Zelensky has said he personally was overseeing this top secret mission.
I mean, I know that there's a lot of discussion on social media today. Will he reach for nuclear weapons? I am not convinced he would do that. It would be a huge gamble to use a tactical nuclear weapon at this point. That would not bring in NATO or even the Trump administration would not then decide to intervene. So I don't think he'll go for nuclear weapons. But I do think probably what he will do is dramatically ramp up attacks across Ukraine, potentially opening up a new front in the north because he's been building up forces in Belarus for an attack on Kharkiv. So that's a possibility. The other possibility is he could try and shut down shipping in the Black Sea by attacking commercial ships in the Black Sea, even if they are not Ukrainian flagged. So in other words, if they're flagged with other countries, he could do that and potentially try to strangle the Ukrainian economy. I'm not losing sleep over the prospect of nuclear weapons. It's a possibility, but I think that he's a rational actor. I think he would realize that if he did that, he would destroy any international support that he might have from the global south and from potentially China. And he would almost certainly bring NATO into a much sharper posture in regards to their role in supporting Ukraine.
Massive win for Ukraine, this latest military attack with the drones. But do you now believe this any chance of a ceasefire is now over between Russia and Ukraine?
Look, to be truthful, there was never any chance of a ceasefire because the Russians were never interested in peace. Putin felt that he was winning on the battlefield. He was happy to string along the Trump administration in talks about ceasefire and talks about talks, but really the Russians were never interested in a ceasefire or a peace deal. So, I think that the ceasefire issue is a side issue. What needs to happen now is for the Europeans in particular, but also I would hope the Trump administration to support Ukraine, give them the means to actually continue the fight so that they can actually force the Russians back out of those key oblasts that the Russians control. So Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and the Crimean Peninsula, and ultimately put the Russians in a difficult situation so that when there is ceasefire talks, it's the Ukrainians and the West that is in the dominant position rather than Russia.
Malcolm, you mentioned earlier that these drone attacks have actually changed not only the situation with Russia at the moment with its military, but the way all of us should see military operations moving forward. What do you think it means for us right now in taking the threat of any drone military operation in the case of war? We should be treating it very seriously now?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, we're being focused very much on the fact that these drones were launched from shipping containers on the backs of trucks. Well, the containerized weapons capability is not a new capability. The Chinese have developed containerized weapons capabilities that they can put on commercial ships, sail those commercial ships into the harbor of an adversary, and then unload drones or missiles from those commercial ships. So if here we had, I think it was about 140 drones attacking the bombers, imagine a scenario where a Chinese commercial vessel sails into the harbor of an opponent and unleashes tens of thousands of drones descending on a city or tens of thousands attacking an airfield. And the other factor to think about is the increasing use of artificial intelligence in these systems so that you no longer need the human controlling the drone controls itself. It flies out, picks its target, works out how it's going to attack and attacks the target. So I think that what we are seeing is an indicator that drone warfare, where humans are removed from the battle space or they're put at a distance in what's known as being on the loop rather than in the loop, I think is coming fast towards us. And from the perspective of Western countries, we need to start thinking about how we defend not only our critical military infrastructure, such as air bases and ports, but also our cities and our critical infrastructure, critical utilities networks and oil and energy and so forth, how we defend those against drone attacks, because this is the sort of threat we will be facing in the next war.
So, Malcolm, to your point, there has been a lot of criticism from the US to Australia asking our federal government to increase its defence spending. The Prime Minister has come out today rejecting that call by the US government. What are your thoughts on it? Are we spending enough money and are we spending it in the right areas?
We're not spending enough money. You should have a look at ASPE's cost of defence report, which came out last week, where we recommended that we go up to 3% of GDP as soon as possible. Well, the US Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, has now said 3.5% as soon as possible. I think Pete Hegseth is correct. We do need to go up to 3.5 as a floor, and we need to do that as soon as possible because the strategic environment that we're in, as acknowledged by the government itself, is the most challenging strategic environment since the end of the Second World War, where we are facing real risks of a major power war within this decade in our region as a result of a Chinese move against Taiwan. And I think that the government needs to recognize this and respond to it as if we're in a pre-war period. And our criticism of the government in the cost of defense report was that they're not doing this. We're acknowledging that they recognize the strategic threat. We're acknowledging that they are planning to boost defense spending up to 2.33% by 2033. But we're making the point that that's too little, too late, given the strategic environment that we're facing. What we need to be doing is increasing defense spending much sooner, much quicker to respond to these threats. And that's our key concern coming out of that report.
Malcolm, considering what's happened from Ukraine in Russia with this new drone warfare, should we be spending money on submarine programs or should we be spending it on the technology of this new frontier that's absolutely here with how we fight wars?
Look, we need both, really, and that's why we're talking between 3 and 3.5% as a floor as soon as possible. The submarines, the nuclear-powered submarines that will be conventionally armed, are really vital for our long-term security. We're getting the first of those in 2033, and then another submarine every 2 years after that until we get into the SSN AUKUS boats in the 2040s. They are important capabilities to meet the longer-term threats, but we also need to invest in capabilities and boost resilience and readiness and sustainability to meet the short-term threats. And what we're arguing is the government has focused on the long-term threats at the expense of dealing with the short-term threats. We need both. And that is why we need to increase defence spending, because we can't do both on where we are at the moment, which is about 2.05 of GDP on defence. Simply not enough money. And what you're seeing is essentially the government taking funds and capabilities from other parts of the Defence Force to cover the cost of the nuclear submarines and also new frigates that will also appear in the 2030s, and leaving the key forces such as Air Force and Army short. So what we're saying is boost defence spending now so that we can cover those long-term capabilities, but we're also better prepared to deal with the short-term risks.
We appreciate your analysis. A very important conversation. Thanks, Malcolm.
Thank you very much.
That was Dr. Malcolm Davis, Senior Defence Expert with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.